In this lesson, we will learn the principles of form in composition, which refers to the change law of motion. In the composition logic, it can be divided into two categories. One emphasizes orderly and structured forms, highlighting that the change of form is predictable, while the other emphasizes the difference, variation and contrast between various forms. Principles emphasizing commonality and order include repetitive composition, approximate composition, gradient composition, and radiative composition. Principles focusing on individuality and contrast comprise variant composition, grouping composition, and contrasting composition. Now let's take a look at them. Let's start with the repetitive composition of principles focusing on commonality and order. Repetition is when the same image appears 2 or more times in the same design. Repetitive composition is where repetition occurs at the intersection of horizontal and vertical lines in composition, or a repetitive arrangement of basic shapes. Designs with repetition makes it easier to leave a strong impression on the viewer, with a sense of rhythm and unity on the whole. Repetitive basic forms visually create a sense of absolute harmony. To seek variation within repetition, attention should be paid to spatial and directional changes when arranging basic forms. The greatest feature of repetition is that the visual characteristics of the basic forms can be enhanced when being arrayed. Arraying, symmetry, rhythm, and other forms are the most commonly used aesthetic principles in design, all of which reflect the repetition of forms. This image is a design of the German pavilion at the 2010 Shanghai World Expo. The exterior design of it employs repetitive lines that are interlaced and connect together, making the outline of the pavilion more coordinated and unified. Now let's take a look at this image of the indoor space. The chairs in the image are repetitively arranged, making the space seem to radiate from the center and achieving an overall unity. Therefore, we can classify repetitive composition into 5 types. They are the repetition of shapes, sides, colors, textures, and directions. For example, the attire of the host in a variety show embodies the repetition of shape and color, telling the audience that they are a group. In some architectural designs, we can also find the repetition of shape, texture, size, and direction, either individually or in combination. The use of it is to achieve unity and coherence. Next, we will study the approximate composition among the principles emphasizing commonality and order. Approximate composition shows the similarity of basic forms in shape, form, size, and so forth. The key to achieving this is that the variation of the basic forms should be basically consistent. The variation should not be too big. Significant differences between each form should be avoided. The variations visually displayed should be consistent. Note that the commonality we refer to is purely based on visual sensation. It is the similarity perceived by the viewer. The forms that look similar may have no scientific correlation. The image on the right here is the Wanke Pavilion at the Shanghai World Expo, composed of 3 approximate forms, which enhances the richness of the overall design. Approximate composition introduces local variations within basic forms, while still retaining overall similarity. Approximation implies common characteristics in shape, size, color, texture, and so on, presenting variation in unity. These architectural designs are all approximate compositions, with each varying in the degree of approximation. Greater approximation will lead to a sense of repetition, while lesser approximation may destroy the sense of unity, losing the significance of approximation. Above all, approximate forms share a familiar relationship. The gradient composition is another principle emphasizing commonality and order. Gradient is a change law of motion, where the basic forms gradually transition in a systematic and orderly manner, or follow a certain trend of change. The most important feature of this principle is that the change of form is predictable. The visual changes in form are relatively similar, and the process of change is orderly. Gradients of basic forms occur in shape, size, direction, color, position, and so on. The third one among the principles emphasizing commonality and order is the radiative composition. Radiation is a common natural phenomenon, such as rays of light, splashing water, or blooming flowers. The radiative composition has three types. The first is the center radiation, characterized by the visual effect of radiating from one or more central points, with a strong sense of movement and rhythm. The second is the spiral radiation. The basic forms of it are arranged in a spiral pattern, gradually expanding to be a spiral radiation. The third is the concentric radiation, which radiates layer by layer from a central point, like the shape of a target. Radiation exhibits directional regularity, with the center of it being the most important visual focal point, where the forms converge or diverge towards the center. This can create strong visual impact, such as an optical sense of motion or a feeling of explosion. The center of the radiation is the focal point. In the design, the central point of the radiation can be singular or multiple, offered or covered, static or dynamic. The image on the right is the British Pavilion at the Shanghai World Expo, composed of lines radiating outward from the center, which enhances the visual impact of the entire design. We can also observe radiative composition from the ceilings of religious buildings. Next, we will learn about the principles of the variant composition that emphasize individuality and contrast. Variant means breaking the order with mild contrasts, with a small constituent part conflicting with the overall order, and maintaining a meaningful or formal connection with the original pattern. This small part is the variant form. In variant composition, constituent elements intentionally violate the established order and highlight a few individual elements to break the regularity. The regularity encompasses the repetitive, approximate, gradient, and radiative compositions as mentioned earlier. The variant effect comes from the comparison. The irregular contrast of the small part visually stimulates people and emerges as a visual focus that breaks monotony, achieving lively visual effects. The variant basic forms follow a new order, but are organically arranged with the original basic forms. Therefore, a transfer of order is visually displayed. The transfer manifests itself in form, size, direction, and position. However, the variant forms displaying the transfer should be smaller than the original forms in size and arranged orderly with them. This principle can highlight the visual contrast through the comparison between the small variant part and the original major part, helping the whole design to be more eye-catching and be a visual focus. Be careful of the proportion of variant components in the whole composition. If the variant effect is not obvious, it will not be noticeable. whereas too much emphasis on the variant will destroy the overall unity. Thus, generally, only one or two visual elements should be made variant in the composition. The principles emphasizing individuality and contrast also include the grouping composition. Grouping is a way of movement in the form, primarily highlighting the rhythm of the movement. Cohesion, dispersion, repulsion, and attraction are inherent to the substances, constituting their internal forces which causes the trend and change in aggregation. Visually, it primarily manifests the movement trends of forms and the positional relations between each form. There is no need to determine the distance. The basic forms can be repetitive, approximate, or gradient, but it should not be too visually complex. The volume of the form should be relatively small. The design intent is conveyed through the arrangement, position, and density of a certain number of basic forms. Finally, the contrasting composition highlights individual differences. Contrast has limits. In a narrow sense, it refers to the visual impact formed by the huge characteristic difference in things. This obvious difference often creates a dramatic visual effect. Contrast conveys the connotation of forms through the strong contrast in appearance. Balance is to adjust the degree of contrast to achieve visual comfort. Contrast is relative and flexible. It can be strong, can be slight, can be significant, can be vague, can be simple and clear, can be complicated. Through the previous learning, we can basically understand the principles of composition, emphasizing commonality and order, including repetitive, approximate, gradient, and radiative compositions. The principles emphasizing individuality and difference include variant, grouping, and contrasting compositions. The exercise of this lesson requires you to collect images embodying the principles of composition in the interior space, including repetitive, approximate, gradient, radiative, variant, grouping, and contrasting compositions, and fully reflecting their spatial characteristics. Okay, that's all for today's lesson. Thank you. Goodbye.